in a dark, cold basement in a quiet Czech town. The walls seemed to close in with the weight of untold horrors. The room was filled with the stench of decay. In the dim light, two small figures could be made out, barely recognizable as children, huddled inside makeshift cages. Their bodies were frail, covered in wounds, evidence of months of unimaginable torment. These were not scenes from a horror movie. They were the reality that officers encountered on that fateful day. In 2007, the Morova family was uncovered as one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse in recent history. Klara Morova was the couple's firstborn, who later welcomed another daughter named Katerina Morova. In 1975, the Morova family lived in Kurim, a quaint Czech Republic village roughly 120 miles from Prague, the capital. The town's residents enjoyed a picturesque natural setting, yet progress was evident with the availability of quality services, education, and commerce. We know that Klara, a beautiful girl with fair hair and blue eyes, began showing signs of schizophrenia at a young age. This severe mental disorder causes those affected to lose touch with reality, impacting their thoughts, feelings, and behavior. They might experience hallucinations, delusions, and other disorders that alter their actions. There are no records indicating that Klara's condition was ever diagnosed by a specialist. However, many stories suggest that her mind was filled with religious fantasies. Katerina began sharing these delusions, as is common among siblings. The younger often tries to emulate the elder. Unfortunately, this imitation extended beyond mere speech or dress, as Katerina also seemed to adopt Klara's schizophrenic tendencies. The two created a feedback loop that only reinforced Klara's beliefs. They fantasized together about the great things they would accomplish, guided by divine will. Despite their delusions, the sisters managed to function well in society. They completed their basic education without significant issues. Klara, after finishing high school, she enrolled in university to study pedagogy. Her life seemed well on track, and she even found love with a man slightly older than her. At 25, their age difference didn't bother them, and soon Klara was pregnant. He was a loving and supportive partner, married Klara, and supported her in every way he could. Their first child, Jacob, brought joy to both parents. Nearly 2 years later, Klara was pregnant again and gave birth to their second child, Andrei. Unfortunately, the relationship began to deteriorate. Years later, Klara's erratic behavior, mood swings, and even aggression pushed the man to his limit, leading him to leave the family and abandon Klara with their 2 young children. Despite this setback, Klara remained committed to her children, supporting them in their studies and extracurricular activities like summer camps, school events, and vacations. However, while she fulfilled her role as a mother, the loneliness and resentment took a toll on her, plunging her into a deep depression. Recognizing her state, Klara invited Katerina to move in. She invited her younger sister to move in with her and the children, hoping her presence and support would help her through the difficult emotional period. At this point, a new figure entered Klara and Katerina's lives, forever altering the family's fate. This was a girl named Anika, who claimed to be 12 years old. Some reports suggest Klara met the girl at university, where Anika confided that she had run away from a youth care center due to mistreatment and had nowhere to go. Other sources claim that it was Katerina, who was working at a local youth institution. Anika was found. She said she had escaped from a child trafficking ring. There are several other versions of Anika's backstory, but they all led to the same conclusion. Anika came into Klara and Katerina's home and brought turmoil with her. These two delusionally devout women opened their doors to a girl who seemed heaven-sent, but harbored an almost unbelievable secret. Anika was not a young girl, but a 32-year-old woman named Barbara Skoll. Barbara had a condition that made her appear much younger than she was. With her childlike face and short stature, Barbara masterfully manipulated those around her, taking advantage of her apparent vulnerability and abandonment. This allowed her to find refuge in several homes where people were moved by her seemingly tragic circumstances. Despite this, only one account was found of a family who had adopted Barbara, believing her to be a helpless young girl. However, it didn't take long before she was returned to the state's child welfare system. The reasons for her return were her violent behavior and unpredictable personality. Some reports even suggest that the family discovered the truth about her actual age. It later became known that Barbara spent a significant portion of her life undergoing psychiatric treatments and was even committed to mental health institutions from which she always managed to escape. This entire backstory was unknown to the Moorova sisters, who quickly grew attached to the supposed helpless child. They took her into their home, and before long, they decided to adopt her. That led directly to disaster. At first, everything seemed to go smoothly with the addition of the so-called child to the family. But soon enough, Barbara began to feel jealous of the affectionate attention Clara's biological children received. She started causing trouble, engaging in mischievous acts and creating disturbances, for which she then blamed the 10- and 8-year-old boys. The boys in turn began to be reprimanded without any real reason. Undoubtedly, these tense situations contributed to the worsening of the Moor. The Moorova sisters were mentally unstable. Barbara's cunning manipulation allowed her to gain power over the women and start exerting control. Around this time, the newly arrived Barbara began talking about the religion she practiced, known as the Grail movement. Our research indicates that the Grail movement is a millenarian apocalyptic religious group that seeks a fundamental change in society, after which everything will be transformed. Followers organized into groups called circles have given the teachings their own interpretations, always based on the principle good deeds on earth guarantee entry into heaven. However, it also appears that these good deeds could absolve any crime committed by members. Barbara belonged to one of these circles and managed to induct Clara and Katharina into it. According to various accounts, this particular group was involved in practices such as violence, abuse, promiscuity, incestuous relationships, and even cannibalism. In this story, the leader of this circle was a man known as the Doctor, who communicated with his followers via text messages, giving them instructions that were often. It is almost unimaginable. One of the first alarming actions that seemingly went unnoticed was when Clara withdrew her son Andres from school. She claimed he had become deaf and mute, and that she would homeschool him from that point on. Any mischief, whether real or fabricated by Barbara, was severely punished. Jacob and Andre began to receive beatings completely disproportionate to the offenses. Whether real or imagined, they were struck with hands, wooden spoons or belts, and even worse, they were locked in small dark rooms at night. Barbara took advantage of the influence she had gained over the sisters. She proposed something even more cruel to correct the children, whom she claimed had become incorrigible, and prevent further misbehavior. They had to be permanently confined. A local blacksmith was called to build a cage. Unaware of its intended purpose, he delivered the iron prison to the basement of the house. The nearly naked children were confined within it. Over the following months, Clara's sons endured a living nightmare following the instructions sent by the doctor through text. The boys were subjected to unimaginable torment. The abuse included being pinched repeatedly, tied up, whipped, and deprived of food for days. They could not leave the cage, so they were forced to relieve themselves inside and sleep on the filth. Once a week, the three women threw buckets of cold water over the children and the entire basement under the pretense of cleaning the foul-smelling area. That wasn't the end of their suffering. At one point, the boys were taken to a cabin, injured in a nearby forest, and locked in small cages. During this time they were even sexually abused. When they returned to their prison in the basement of the family home, the situation became even worse. Barbara devised a plan to start feeding the boys abundantly while they remained in the cage, intending to fatten them up. One day, the three women descended into the basement. Clara asked her younger son to extend a leg out through the bars of the cage. The terrified child obeyed, and immediately his leg was grabbed by Katharina and Barbara. While Clara made a quick cut with her, they used a sharp tool to cut the flesh and shared it among them as they laughed hysterically. This nightmare worthy of a horror movie continued for a period of about 6 months, from December 2006 to mid-2007. During those months, Barbara had another brilliant idea. They purchased baby monitoring cameras and installed one in the basement. This allowed the women to not only supervise the children's every move, but also watch their suffering whenever one of them went down to torment them while the others attended to household chores. They were unaware that this brilliant idea would lead to their downfall. On May 10, 2007, a neighbor saw a sister installing a baby monitor in her home to keep an eye on her newborn while she slept. After setting up the camera, she turned on the monitor to check that everything was working correctly. To her horror, instead of her baby's crib, the screen showed a dark place where a small child, his arms tied behind his back, the boy was struggling to pick up food from the floor with his mouth. At one point, the screen showed an adult woman's hand holding something while the boy desperately tried to eat it. The image made it clear that the child was in terrible condition, with only a thin layer of skin covering his bones. The neighbor was horrified by what he saw and immediately contacted the police to report the shocking scene. Moments later, officers arrived at his home and viewed the horrific images for themselves. Given the range of the equipment, it was clear that the boy was being abused. It was clear that the source of this horror was very close by. The officers were determined to end the nightmare immediately. They began knocking on the doors of all the neighboring homes. The first few residents had no issue letting them inspect every room. However, when they reached the house where the Morova sisters lived, they were reluctant to allow the police to enter. Nevertheless, the officers were able to gain access to the house during the inspection. They found a small door under a staircase that was locked. The officers called for firefighters, who broke open the door. What they found inside was beyond imagination. As they entered the space, they were hit by a terrible stench that permeated the entire area. The first thing they saw was a frightened girl, clutching a teddy bear, who ran directly toward the officers, screaming that she and her brothers had been hurt by their adoptive mother and aunt. One officer took the girl outside while the others were left stunned at the sight of two nearly naked boys. Their bodies were covered. The officers found the boys locked in cages like animals, wounds all over their bodies. One of the boys was unconscious. The boys were freed immediately and taken to the hospital for treatment. The girl, who wasn't physically harmed, was also taken into custody. Clara and Katharina were arrested. Jacob had some wounds that were treated, but none required hospitalization, so both children were taken to a child protection center. Andrei, the younger boy, was in critical condition. Upon arriving at the hospital, he had a panic attack and began screaming. He claimed he was seeing ghosts and begged the doctors to end his life. The situation was tragic. Once he was calm, the doctors were astonished by what they saw on the boy's body. He was covered in scars, bruises, and open wounds, one of which was particularly large on one of his buttocks. He had to remain hospitalized for proper treatment. While the physical wounds on their bodies healed, the trauma caused by months of horrific abuse at the hands of their mother and others would be much harder to overcome. Meanwhile, investigations began to uncover the truth about what had happened behind closed doors in that house and in the lives of its inhabitants. At the same time, the children who were placed in a care center became the focus of study by specialists. There are sources that describe the behavior of Barbara, still believed by everyone at this point to be Anika. The supposed young girl was extremely difficult and even hostile, refusing to cooperate with counselors and specialists. She displayed aggression and defiance. However, she also began to make mistakes that hinted at the truth. For instance, during an initial assessment of her mental state, she was given paper and crayons to draw whatever she wished. Instead of childlike drawings, she produced complex geometric shapes and advanced mathematical calculations far beyond what would be expected of a 13-year-old. Unfortunately, the studies on Anika were never completed, just days after she escaped through a window without leaving a trace. Security forces immediately began searching for the girl, distributing flyers with her photo and details as part of the effort to find her. They soon received tips from various sources claiming to recognize the person in the photo. The sources asserted that she was a 33-year-old woman named Barbara. Barbara received help from a known couple who provided her with their son's documents to leave the country. She initially traveled to Denmark. From there, she went to Oslo, Norway. In Norway, Barbara once again altered her appearance, shaving her head and posing as a 13-year-old boy named Adam. She approached authorities claiming she was fleeing from an abusive father. Multiple sources recount that Adam was taken in by a family and enrolled in a school, where he was soon regarded as a gifted student. This charade continued for several months, but the Czech authorities did not give up. With the cooperation of international colleagues, they managed to piece together the puzzle. DNA analysis eventually confirmed Barbara's true identity. Her true identity was confirmed, leading to her arrest. She was subsequently extradited back to the Czech Republic to face charges. Upon her return, Barbara underwent various psychological evaluations. At least one specialist who interacted with her observed signs of psychotic tendencies. One of the most striking pieces of information was that Barbara's capture in Norway was reportedly triggered by a concerned schoolteacher. The teacher had been alarmed after Barbara, posing as Adam, drew a picture depicting 7 bruised and bleeding children, each with on Friday, May 2008, Dozens of journalists and camera crews descended upon the municipal court in the Czech city of Brno. They were there to capture images of Barbara being escorted in along with Katharina. The two women were charged with deceiving the staff of a childcare facility by presenting Barbara as a 13-year-old adopted girl named Annika. The court reportedly dismissed some of the charges, but that did not mean they were free. They were immediately detained and charged with the charges included serious offenses related to child abuse, as well as allegations involving 4 other individuals connected to the sect. As the trial commenced, Clara appeared visibly diminished and distressed, entering the courtroom alongside her sister. Barbara also entered the courtroom accompanied by 3 other individuals. When it was Clara's turn to testify, she admitted to the violence she had inflicted on her children over several months. However, she asserted that she had been manipulated by her sister, Katharina and Barbara. Clara stated that they had driven Hirsch was driven into a state of delusion and immersed in the cult of the Grail movement to the point where she could no longer comprehend the gravity of her actions. There are also reports that Barbara claimed to have been a victim of violence at the hands of the Maware, but the court largely dismissed these claims and few believed her. The judge had the opportunity to hear from Jacob and Andre themselves, who recounted the series of horrific ordeals they endured. They described how the accused they forced them to live for months in near starvation, in inhumane conditions, violated their privacy, and even cannibalized parts of their bodies. During the hearings, the officers who had entered the House of Horrors also testified. One officer recounted how, upon entering the basement, they immediately saw a child lying naked on the floor. He noted that the Morova sisters showed no concern for the child's health, and the girl identified as Anika tried to impede the officers' movements, clinging to their legs. At the end of the hearings, the case prosecutor stated that the motive behind these horrific acts was to force the children into complete submission to the religious goals of the accused. When delivering his sentence, the judge noted that the ultimate goal of the horrifying acts described during the trial was to create a person with a completely broken will. The judge emphasized that the events were aimed at the deliberate destruction of a child's soul, adding that while there were indications of a cult's involvement, there was no concrete evidence to support this claim. The judge announced his decision, declaring all 6 accused guilty and issuing their respective sentences. Clara Balwarova, the mother of the boys, was sentenced to 9 years in a maximum security prison. Her sister, Katharina, was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security prison. The other 3 individuals were found guilty of abuse and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Finally, Barbara, then 34 years old, was found guilty of repeated abuse and extreme cruelty, receiving a mere 5-year prison sentence. The existence of the so-called doctor who was purportedly directing the group's actions could never be confirmed. Some people were struck by what seemed to be shockingly lenient sentences for the monstrous actions carried out by those responsible for committing the worst forms of violence against 2 completely innocent children. Furthermore, we found reports indicating that Barbara was released on parole after serving only half of her sentence. She was released after spending just over 2 years in prison. Her lawyer argued that her mental health had significantly deteriorated, which contributed to her early release. Jacob and Andre, with the help of specialized care, have overcome the deep trauma caused by the horrific acts they endured and have continued with their lives. However, it is certain that those events will never be erased from their minds.